So about 3 months ago, I sat in my office at night. I wasn't really sleeping very well, and because my mind was running. And it was running because I had just read some policy documents on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website in relationship to Bill C-16, and at the same time I had heard that the University of Toronto HR and Equity Vice President had decided to make anti-unconscious bias training mandatory for her staff, which I find appalling, and still find appalling. And I would recommend that if any of you are asked or required to have your unconscious biases adjusted, that you might note to yourself that by agreeing to do so, you have agreed that you're guilty. And I wouldn't recommend that. Anyways, I was mostly trying to straighten out my thoughts on these issues, and that's usually what I do when I speak, because I have a good reputation as a speaker, and I think there's two reasons for that. And one is I don't ever speak to a group. I always speak to individuals. I'm not speaking to the group. I'm speaking to individual people. And I'm not telling you what's right, because I don't know what's right. What I'm trying to do is to formulate my thoughts more clearly. And it's helpful to do that in speech, even in front of an audience, because it's a dialogue with an audience. If you watch the individuals, then you can tell if they're following you, or mostly whether they're following you, if they can understand the line of the argumentation. And some of them will be shaking their heads, and some of them will be nodding, and some of them will be looking puzzled, in which case you have to kind of reformulate. And so, and that's how to think, and when you're speaking to people, it's okay to tell them what you know, but better to show them how you think. And that means you're going to stumble around like an idiot some of the time, because you're trying to grapple with things. And what I try to do for my students is to model the process of grappling with things, because that's what you do when you think. And Norman pointed out that you can be right, or you can try to get smarter. And to be right, then you convince people that you're right, but to try to get smarter, you find out why you're wrong. And so I decided a long time ago that one of the ways to deal with my authoritarian tendencies, let's say, was to make friends with what I don't know instead of what I do know. And that's a whole different way of looking at the world, and it's got its pain, because you're always trying to figure out more or less why you're a biased moron, and that's a very long list of you have a very long list of reasons for that, and then you have to find out why you're wrong. And as a short-term mechanism for attaining psychological stability, I wouldn't recommend it. But as a long-term process where you're trying to make things work better in the medium to long term, then it's the only way. But it's easy to sacrifice the future for the present, although it's kind of the reverse of the way you should do things. So anyways, I made these videos, pretty amateur videos, and the lighting wasn't very good, and there was a bunch of things wrong with them. And but one of the things I've been wondering about for the last 3 months is just what happened? Like, what's going on here? This is crazy. And I've been accused of a lot of things, some of which are no doubt true, but I've been accused of being a racist and being a transphobe, and what else? Profiteering, and I guess the other one was scaremongering. Yeah, that's the other one, scaremongering. And so, of course, I've been wondering if those things are true, because it's not like, my heart is as pure as the driven snow, hardly, and everyone has biases and all of that. So, and I also, while this unfolded, had a group of friends who were definitely critics, who were watching everything I was doing, and letting me know pretty forthrightly when I was being arrogant, and when I was looked kind of disheveled, and when my arguments weren't as clear as they could be, and and these were smart people, and their comments were very incisive. And then, of course, I had all the blowback, and I was paying attention to it, because, well, you should pay attention to such things. And I do pay attention to things, that's the thing. I actually pay attention to things. And if I'm embroiled in a controversy, even if it's a like problem in my home, I try to get to the damn bottom of it. And you know, the bottom of things is not a pretty place to look. And so, you know, when you're arguing with someone at home, even someone you love, you'll notice that your argument can get out of hand, pretty quick. So if you're arguing with your wife or your husband, you know, and it depends on how volatile you are, of course. But, you know, you start arguing about some little thing, and then you come to understand pretty quick that it's actually not about that little thing at all. That little thing is associated with, you know, a little bigger thing underneath that, and maybe that's associated with even a bigger thing under that, and you know, soon you're taking each other apart for, assuming you've been married for 20 years, for all the stupid things you've done to each other over the last 20 years, and it doesn't have to end there, and that's not pleasant. It's really hard to bind a conversation so it doesn't go everywhere, you know. So one thing you can do, if you're talking to someone about something you disagree with, someone you love, you can tell them a bunch of good things about what they've been doing, which you actually believe, and then just say, well, but there's this little problem here, and I'd just like it adjusted in a minor way, and maybe that'll, you know, sort things out a bit between us, and then maybe you don't fall into that stupid pit, which is really easy to fall into, and you know, which certainly can lead to divorce, among other things. And so a huge part of the issue always is just exactly what is this about? Well, I've been asking myself that question for a long, long time, because I've been interested in authoritarian conflict and atrocity and totalitarianism for way longer than anyone with any sanity should ever be interested in it. And you know, and then this all came up, and I thought, okay, it's like, all right, well, you know, am I a bigot and a transphobe? Well, I probably have my biases, because people tend to have in-group biases, you know, and that's associated, by the way, with compassion, just so you know it, because one of the things compassion does is make you much more strongly bound to your in-group, you know. It's like a mother is compassionate because she loves her baby, and she loves the baby more than other things that aren't the baby, obviously. And so actually compassion is one of the main sources of in-group bias, which is something for the compassion warriors to think about for like 3/5 of a second. There's nothing less compassionate to you than a mother grizzly bear protecting her cubs. And so you should think about that when you think about empathy for a minute, because empathy is by no means an untrammeled moral virtue. In fact, it's responsible and can be responsible for absolutely atrocious actions. It depends on who you're empathizing with, you know. And if you're empathizing with someone that you regard as an infantilized victim, then you automatically snap into a frame of mind where everyone who might be oppressing that infantilized victim is a predatory parasite, and you're not very bloody empathetic to them, I can tell you. So that's a big problem. Anyways, with regards to this scaremongering issue, so yeah, biased, yeah, probably, and blind, definitely. Like more than you might expect? No, I don't think so. And one of the things that actually protected me through all this was that, you know, I've actually tried to come to terms with the evil that lurks in human hearts, particularly my own, and I have 500 hours of lectures on that online. If anybody, you know, has the bizarre desire to pound their way through them, they can more or less figure out what I think, because I've said 500 hours of it publicly, and so I didn't feel too bad about my level of bigotry or hatred. You know, I think you could probably infer that by watching the videos, so it's kind of protected on that front. And then there was the scaremongering issue, and that's a good one. That's a tough one, man, because, you know, if you look at Bill C-16, it just kind of looks like, well, we're extending protection to another oppressed group, which isn't actually true, because gender identity, by the way, no, gender expression, that's not a group. I'd just like to point that out, because terminological accuracy actually matters. So we've extended legal protection to fashion, essentially, and you can say, well, maybe I'm, you know, being a bit intransigent about that, but I read the damn policies and I don't think I am. And that's not a group, so that's an indication of the muddle-headedness behind the legislation. And then the federal government, the Department of Justice, did say on their own website that they were going to interpret that law in light of the policies of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And so fine, man, go to the Ontario Human Rights Commission if they haven't taken the policies off yet, and read what they're up to. And if you agree with that, well, good, agree with it. But I would suspect that if you agree with it, you didn't understand it, or you're up to something. And that comes to the next part. What are we really talking about here? Well, so we could be talking about my biases and my proclivity to scaremonger, and fair enough, but here's some reasons we're not. And one is that I have all those lectures online, and believe me, if there would have been a phrase in any of them that indicated that there was something even vaguely morally corrupt about me, it would have been paraded around as evidence. You can be sure of that. So that's kind of a relief. I did a lot of soul searching in the last couple of months, and it's not like I'm without my problems, but anyways, so what is this about? Well, we'll say, hopefully it's not about me, because that'd be stupid. And so what's going on? Why are all these people watching these videos, these things I made just to figure out what it was that I was thinking, because I couldn't sleep one night, and because I'm not very damn happy about that unconscious bias stuff, which I would regard as absolutely reprehensible, that you could be held guilty for your implicit perceptions. Think about that. God, they use that test as a diagnostic test. It doesn't meet the criteria for reliability and validity that you'd use for a diagnostic test. It doesn't produce the same results one time after another, and you can use it to target anybody. And so go along with it if you want and just see what happens. Anyways, so I've been thinking about this, like, what's going on? Why the outcry? You think, well, Professor Peterson got his 15 minutes of fame. It's like, well, I had my 15 minutes of, trivial fame several times in my life, and there's some good things about it, but I am, despite what you might think, a rather private person, and so it's not like I'm particularly enjoying it. But I thought something, when I made those videos, I thought, this is something I learned from reading mythology. If you have to fight a dragon, you should go to its lair before it comes to your village. And so people think of what I did as courageous, and I don't think that's right. I just think that I can see danger coming, and you get to pick your anxiety. I could either be anxious about speaking, or I could be anxious about not speaking. And so I chose to be anxious about speaking. And that's not exactly courage. It's more like common sense. But that assumes that you're looking into the future. So you might say, well, what gives me any special power to look into the future? And hey, that's a good question. I mean, God only knows what's going to happen in the next few years. I did read today, this is cool, 250,000 people will be lifted out of absolute poverty today, and 300,000 more will be connected to electricity. And we're knocking poverty rates around the world down faster by a huge margin than we ever have in human history. There was an article in the New York Times today called Why 2016 Was the Best Year Ever. It's really worth reading. I concluded the same thing. I worked for a UN committee a couple of years ago, and I was looking at what was going to happen down the road, and everything I kept reading was, well, wow, we're getting rid of polio, we're getting rid of elephantiasis, which you really don't want to have, we're getting rid of guinea worm, we're getting rid of polio, we're knocking malaria back into the swamps from where it comes, we're lifting people out of poverty. It's like, man, we're doing a lot of good things. You'd sure never guess that by the way we treat ourselves. So anyways, so what's going on? Okay, so I thought, well, I better think about this. I've been thinking about it a long time. So the right wing is really hard on the Frankfurt School. In the Frankfurt School were these kind of neo-Marxist guys who combined Marxism with Freudianism in the 1940s, and they were avowed neo-Marxists, so it's not like I'm making an accusation. And they were kind of anti-system type people and all of that. But I think to lay what's happening at the universities and in the broader culture itself at the feet of the Frankfurt School is insufficient. I really think that it's primarily a consequence of the French intellectuals who, and this is obviously an oversimplification, who emerged out of Marxism in the early 1970s and produced postmodernism. Now, the thing about the postmodernist types is they're nested inside Marxism. They say that straight out. I'm not inventing this. You read Derrida, who's like the joker at the head of the postmodernist movement, and I mean joker because he's an intellectual clown, and that doesn't mean he's stupid, because he is not stupid, not at all. These people are not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. They know precisely what they're doing. They're a hell of a lot more educated about what they're doing than you are, unless you happen to be one of them. And they mean exactly what they say, just like people always do when they tell you what they're going to do, or they write it down. And they say straight out on their websites, say the women's studies websites, we think the patriarchy is an oppressive structure that should be broken down to its core, and they mean core conceptions. It's not just social, it's linguistic, philosophical, and attitudinal. It should be broken down, wiped out, and restructured from the bottom up, and they mean that. So when it's not accidental, any of this, and I know it sounds like a bloody paranoid conspiracy theory, but you know, I've always been of the idea, especially from reading Jung, that people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And these are powerful ideas. There's a good book called Explaining Postmodernism that I might recommend by a guy named Stephen R.C. Hicks, and his first chapter, which isn't very long, is a good introduction to political correctness. But so why do I think this is about that? Well, here's my reasons. I mean, it doesn't seem to be about me. I think all I did was I made the general specific, okay, which is kind of what you have to do if you really want to make a point. A point, right? That's one place if you want to make a point. And my point was, I'm not saying made-up words generated by postmodern neo-Marxists, because I despise everything they stand for. And so I'm not using those damn words. And that's that. And it's not like I have something against transgender people. I'm sure some of them are lovely people and some of them aren't. You know, and so they can do whatever they want as far as I'm concerned, as long as they can do whatever they want as far as I'm concerned, as long as I'm not forced to go along with the most radical representatives of them who don't even speak for them anyways. I've got like 20 letters from transsexual people supporting what I've done, and like none opposing it. You know, one of the things that's kind of cool is I've only got 3 hate letters. I thought 3? Jesus, you guys aren't trying very hard. Like, and I got like 1,000 letters of support. And if you go on YouTube, where I'm radically overrepresented, and you look at the comments and the likes and the dislikes, it's about the same ratio. It's like likes to dislikes is like about 100 to 1, and almost all the comments are positive, which, you know, could easily be a selection bias, and probably is, but, you know, it still means that there's quite a few people who think that what I'm doing is sort of okay as far as they're concerned, and so that's important. So, anyways, we need to talk a little bit about postmodernism. Okay, so let's go back to France in the end of the 1960s. So, and this is, of course, an oversimplification, and I'm sure I'm wrong about some of it because, you know, it's not exactly my field of speciality, this sort of sociology. I'm more of a scientist type, but, and if I read philosophy, I tend not to read second-rate philosophy, and so I've tried to avoid the postmodernists to some degree because their incoherency is one of the least of their sins, but they don't care about that. No, you've got to understand, man. It's modernists and Enlightenment people and even traditionalists who care about coherency. The postmodernists don't believe in coherency. They don't believe in, and I'm not making this up, this is part of their philosophy. They don't believe in logic. You know, Derrida says straight out that Western society is phallo-logocentric, by which he means male-centered and privileging the idea of logic. Well, he doesn't buy any of that. He doesn't think that there's a truth that's out there. He doesn't believe that individuals can reach any sort of truth by thinking. He certainly doesn't believe that we can move towards truth in dialogue, because that's dialogic, right? There's none of that. You wonder, well, why do the postmodern types keep other thinkers off the campus? Well, it's not because they're afraid. Well, although some of them are, but they use their fragility as a mask for their, you know, their underlying philosophical and political interests. They do that fragmentarily. It's not like every social justice warrior is a, you know, sword-carrying postmodernist, but the ideas are fragmented and distributed among them like they're distributed among a mob, and if you put the whole mob together, you get the whole postmodernist thing happening at the same time, and that's how ideas have people instead of the other way around. Anyways, forget about logic. That's out the window. That's just a construct of Western society, and the whole point of the construct was to oppress other people and to take their wealth and to privilege the people who live within that so-called logic system so that they can justify to themselves and other people their predator rapaciousness, straight and simple. And that's partly because postmodernism was influenced by Marxism, and of course that's what the Marxists think about any situation where there's a, let's call it a power status differential. The people at the top are only there because they've stole everything from the people at the bottom. And so the Marxists in France realized by the end of 1960s, thereabouts, when even Jean-Paul Sartre finally figured out that to be a communist probably wasn't acceptable, given that the bloody Soviets had killed like 30 million people between 1919 and 1959, and the Maoists had done the same thing on a greater scale in China, and then we could talk about North Korea, and we could talk about, you know, but whatever, you know, students don't learn any of that in school anymore, and even if they did, they wouldn't want to listen to it. When I tell my students in my second-year psychology class about the Gulag Archipelago, hardly any of them know. Well, why is that? Well, it's because they haven't been taught it. Why is that? Well, see if you can figure it out. All right, so anyways, back to the postmodern types. So, you know, it got to the point where there was just no way you could be a Marxist, especially after Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn wrote this great book, which is actually out of print, for crying out loud, which I've actually been able to popularize like mad over the last 3 months, which is, you know, really mind-boggling. And what Solzhenitsyn did in his genius manner, because he's up there with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, like, man, that guy, he's a towering intellect and a person of spectacular moral force, you know, like, he put himself on the line for that book. He memorized it when he was in the prison camps. It's 3 volumes that thick, you know. It's like 2,000 pages of someone screaming, the smartest person you've ever met, the wisest person you've ever met, screaming in outrage for 2,000 pages. It's no bloody wonder it's out of print. Anyways, what Solzhenitsyn did was take on this claim you often hear the radical leftists make about communism, about Marxism. They say, well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, okay, well, how many countries do you need to disprove your thesis? How many millions of people have to die before you might admit that you're wrong? Well, obviously more than 100 million, because that's the approximate total. That's probably an underestimate, but we'll be conservative, because adding another 10 million doesn't really make that much difference. So Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart, partly in his book Lenin in Zurich, and then partly in the Gulag Archipelago. But groundwork had already been laid for all that by Nietzsche, who knew exactly what was coming in the 20th century, and by Dostoevsky, who wrote a book called The Possessed back in like 1880, where he outlined in painful detail the precise mindset that would produce the Russian Revolution like 30 years later. Amazing. And Tolstoy as well, he knew what was coming. It made him suicidal. He wrote in his confession that the conflict between the ideas of Russia, the traditional ideas, and the Enlightenment ideas sweeping in from the West, they blew his worldview apart, which was traditional religious, blew his worldview apart so badly that he was suicidal at the height of his fame. Tolstoy knew what was going to come too. And so it's not like Solzhenitsyn was the only person who could see this. Orwell knew it. Malcolm Muggeridge knew it in the 1930s when he was noting that the Soviets, given their idea of class guilt, which sounds a lot like white privilege to me, or any other form of racism, they used that doctrine to just round up all the kulaks. They were the productive farmers and shipped them off to Siberia, and then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death, but you know, they had too many Ukrainians anyway, so it didn't really matter. So anyways, back to the postmodern types. Well, you know, this all was revealed in such painful detail that even the kind of closed-minded ideologue that Norman referred to just couldn't quite muster up the moral courage to keep beating the same damn drum. So what they did instead, being highly intelligent individuals, was play a game of sleight of hand and transformed these Marxist presuppositions into postmodernism in the 1970s. And the idea basically was, well, the working class isn't going to rise up and crush the bourgeoisie because, first of all, they're getting rich, and that wasn't supposed to happen. And second, well, it sort of seemed to be a catastrophe when that occurred, let's say, in Russia. And so maybe we won't do that anymore because the working class actually isn't buying into this either, which is also a problem. You know, having internalized their own oppression, they wouldn't buy into this, to the global myth of utopia. So maybe it's because they had some sense. It's certainly possible. But anyways, the sleight of hand was, oh, well, fine, we'll just play a different oppressor versus oppressed game, and we'll introduce identity politics. It's like, okay, you're not being oppressed because you're a member of the working class, you're being oppressed because you're a woman. Or you're being oppressed because you have an ethnicity that's outside the main paradigm, whatever that might be. Or it's because of your sexual preference or your sexual identity, whatever places you in some manner outside the normative culture. And you know, the thing is, the postmodernists, you know, you might think, well, your culture is good for something. It gives you a hierarchy of value. It rewards competent people. It gives you a direction so you can climb up, you know, because otherwise everything's leveled to nothing, and then why do anything? Well, they don't care about any of that. They don't believe that there's any such thing as competence. They don't believe that there's any such thing as up. This is all, postmodernism wipes all of that out. And so when the postmodernists analyze a text, all they care about is how it privileges the position of the author and who it oppresses. And that's the only thing they regard as real. And they don't believe in grand unifying narratives. They don't believe that there's a Canadian identity. They don't believe that there's an American identity. They don't believe that there's a Western identity. They don't believe that value structures exist, or if they are, they're irreplaceable with some other value structure. They certainly don't believe that they have any biological grounding, that there's any such thing as a human being. It's all socially constructed, which is really convenient if what you want to do is be the author of an entirely social constructed utopia that you can run. And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is zero. So there's